The cartel thought she was just an old woman, a quiet grandmother with no fight left in her. But when they hurt the one person she loved, they unknowingly awakened a ghost from the past. Elena Morales, once an elite undercover operative, had spent years in hiding. Now she's back, and the ruthless men who once ruled this town with fear are about to learn a brutal lesson. Death moves in silence. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us, where are you watching from? Share in the comments below. San Luis Potosi had once been a place of life, a town where families gathered in the central plaza, where children played in the dusty streets without fear, and where the aroma of fresh tamales filled the air every morning. Now silence had settled over the town like a suffocating blanket, broken only by the distant hum of approaching trucks or the occasional burst of gunfire in the night. The people no longer spoke freely, their voices stolen by fear. Doors were locked early, shopkeepers kept their heads down, and no one dared to look too long at the black SUVs that prowled the streets like hungry wolves. Los Sangrientos had made sure of that. Their presence wasn't just felt. It was carved into the bones of the town. The graffiti on the walls, the scent of burnt rubber from torched vehicles, the sound of hushed prayers whispered in candle-lit homes, it all told the same story. This was no longer a town belonging to its people. It belonged to Vicente El Rey Morales. He didn't need to walk the streets to prove it. His name alone was enough. Those who had seen him described a man who commanded respect not through theatrics or flashy displays of wealth, but through quiet, calculated terror. Vicente wasn't one to parade his power. He didn't waste words on long speeches or dramatic threats. He spoke once, and his orders were followed. If they weren't, people disappeared. If they were lucky, their families got to bury what was left. No one opposed him, not the local politicians, who had long ago learned that siding with Los Sangrientos was the only way to survive. Not the police, whose paychecks were signed in blood and cartel money. Even the church, the last refuge of many desperate souls, knew better than to pray too loudly against the devil who now ruled their town. It hadn't always been this way. Just a few years ago, the cartel had existed in the shadows, operating in the outskirts, making their deals quietly. But when Vicente took over, things changed. He wasn't content with running drugs through the highways. He wanted control of the businesses, the people, the land itself. He expanded rapidly, swallowing small gangs, eliminating competition, until the town was his to command. And with his rule came fear. His second-in-command, Juan Diablo Carrera, ensured that fear was never forgotten. If Vicente was the king, then Juan was his executioner. He was the one people truly feared, the one who carried out punishments with a sadistic pleasure that even other cartel members found unsettling. He didn't just kill, he made examples. Bodies weren't just buried, they were displayed, tortured, left in the middle of the streets as messages to those who even considered resisting. The town had learned its lesson. There was no justice here, no police force to run to. The law belonged to Los Sangrientos. If someone had a problem, they didn't call the authorities. They paid the cartel. If a business was struggling, they didn't look for loans. They borrowed from Vicente, at a cost that no bank would ever dare to charge. If someone went missing, no one asked questions. Questions got people killed. Even those who had once believed they could fight back had been silenced. A few shopkeepers had tried to stand together to refuse the extortion payments. They were found hanging from the town's only bridge by sunrise. A school teacher had spoken out after one of her students was recruited by the cartel. Her house was burned to the ground with her inside. After that, no one spoke. No one resisted. San Luis Potosi was a town held hostage, its people prisoners in their own homes. And the worst part was that they had accepted it. Because in a town where the law was dead, survival meant obedience. Elena Sandoval had lived in San Luis Potosi for nearly 20 years. her presence so unassuming that most people barely noticed her. She was known simply as Abuela to the locals, a frail old woman who ran a modest bakery at the edge of the market square. Every morning, before the sun had fully risen, the scent of fresh conchas and empanadas drifted through the streets, a brief comfort in a town otherwise drowning in fear. Children often gathered outside her shop, their faces pressed against the glass as they watched her work. She would always greet them with a soft smile, slipping them extra pastries when no one was looking. To the outside world, she was nothing more than a kind, aging widow, a woman whose legs had betrayed her, confining her to a wheelchair and forcing her to rely on others for simple tasks. Her hands, once steady and strong, had grown thinner, their veins more pronounced with time. Her silver hair was always tied neatly into a bun, her face marked with the lines of a life well lived. But for all the warmth she exuded, there was something about her that people couldn't quite place. Unlike the other elderly women in town, who gossiped openly about their families, Elena rarely spoke of her past. She had no relatives in San Luis Potosí, no childhood friends who could recall where she had come from. The only family she acknowledged was her grandson, Alejandro, a young man with a sharp mind and a rebellious heart. He was the only one who seemed to matter to her, and he too had little knowledge of the life she had lived before settling in the town. Rumors had long surrounded the mysterious grandmother in the wheelchair. Some believed she had once been married to a wealthy man in Mexico City, only to lose him in a tragic accident that forced her into hiding. Others whispered that she had fled from an abusive husband, seeking refuge in a town where no one would ask too many questions. A few even speculated that she had once belonged to a criminal family herself, but had chosen a different path. Whatever the truth was, no one dared to ask. The cartel soldiers who patrolled the streets barely spared her a glance. To them, she was nothing, an old woman, crippled and powerless, with nothing to offer and nothing to fear. The younger recruits laughed when they saw her struggling to push her chair over the uneven cobblestone streets, often mocking her as they passed. Even the local shopkeepers, who respected her for her kindness, saw her as fragile, and Elena let them believe it. She kept her head down, her movements slow and deliberate, never drawing attention to herself. She paid her protection fees like everyone else, never questioning the authority of Los Sangrientos. She never flinched when gunfire echoed through the town, never gasped when bodies appeared on the streets. She listened to the whispered fears of her neighbors, but never joined in their conversations. She was invisible in a way that only the weak could be. But beneath the mask of frailty, beneath the trembling hands and tired eyes, there was something else, something cold, calculated, waiting. The world had long believed that Elena Sandoval was nothing more than an old woman living out the last of her days in a dying town. They had no idea they were living alongside a ghost. Juan Diablo Carrera did not just enforce Vicente Morales's rule. He relished it. Where Vicente was cold and methodical, Juan was raw brutality, a man who did not just kill but turned death into a spectacle. His name carried a weight of terror, whispered in homes and feared even among those who served the cartel. If Vicente was the king, then Juan was his executioner, the devil who delivered punishment with a cruel smile and hands that had long since forgotten mercy. No one knew exactly where Juan had come from. Some said he had been a butcher's son, learning from a young age how to carve flesh with precision. Others claimed he had been a soldier, dishonorably discharged for excessive violence. What was certain was that he had found his place in Los Sangrientos and had risen quickly through the ranks, not through strategy or intelligence, but through sheer savagery. He was a man who understood fear, who knew how to make it crawl under the skin and settle deep in the bones. Public executions were his signature. Whenever someone dared to defy the cartel, it was Juan who made an example of them. The town had long since lost count of how many bodies he had left in the streets, how many warnings he had carved into flesh for others to see. Men who refused to pay were strung up from telephone poles. their eyes gouged out as a message that no one was beyond the cartel's reach. Women who spoke out found their husbands and sons taken in the night, their fates whispered about but never confirmed. His methods were not just violent, they were deliberate. He believed in suffering, in drawing it out until the victim broke completely. Sometimes he made their families watch. Other times, he let them find what was left the next morning. Either way, the message was always clear. There was no mercy in Los Sangrientos. The police did nothing. Those who tried to interfere quickly learned that Juan had no patience for disloyalty. An officer had once attempted to report him to federal authorities. His severed head was later found outside the police station, his badge stuffed into his mouth. After that, no one questioned the cartel's rule. But Juan's thirst for violence was not just about control. He enjoyed it. He took pleasure in the fear in people's eyes, in the way their voices trembled when they spoke his name. To him, pain was an art form, and he was its most skilled artist. And now his gaze was turning toward a new problem, the silent, invisible force that had begun striking from the shadows. Bodies of cartel members had started appearing, not with the crude brutality of rival gangs, but with surgical precision. There were no witnesses, no warnings, just death, swift and efficient. Juan did not know who was responsible yet, but he did not care. Hunting ghosts was just another game, and he had always enjoyed the hunt. Los Sangrientos had sunk their claws deep into San Luis Potosí, and with each passing day their grip tightened. What had once been a slow creep of influence had become a full-scale occupation, and the people of the town were left with two choices: submit or disappear. The first businesses to fall under their control had been the wealthiest: the pharmacies, the auto shops, the larger grocery stores. These were easy targets, run by owners who had more to lose and who would rather pay than fight. The cartel didn't just take a percentage of the profits. They took control. They decided which suppliers the businesses could use, how much they could charge, and, in some cases, even who could buy from them. Those who cooperated were allowed to operate, albeit under the suffocating weight of Los Sangrientos rule. Those who hesitated were made examples of. At first, the extortion demands had been manageable, just enough to remind the business owners who was in charge. But greed was insatiable. The payments grew steeper, the demands more unreasonable. Some business owners were forced to choose between paying the cartel or feeding their families. When they couldn't pay, the punishment was swift. A mechanic's shop was burned down in the middle of the night. The owner of a butcher shop was found hanging from a lamppost, his body mutilated beyond recognition. Even those who tried to comply were not safe. If the cartel believed an owner was hiding money, they would take more, sometimes wiping out an entire family in the process. No one could argue, no one could refuse. There was no law, no higher authority to turn to. The police were either on Vicente Morales's payroll or too afraid to intervene. Complaints didn't just fall on deaf ears, they put a target on the complainant's back. The fear spread like a disease, and soon, the entire town was infected. Streets that had once been filled with the laughter of children were now patrolled by cartel soldiers, their rifles slung lazily over their shoulders, their presence a constant reminder of who truly ruled San Luis Potosí. The market, once a lively place of bargaining and conversation, had grown quieter. Vendors still set up their stalls, but they no longer called out to customers with the same enthusiasm. They counted their earnings carefully, already knowing how much would be stolen from them at the end of the day. It wasn't just the businesses. The cartel had eyes everywhere, informants who listened, who watched, who reported every whisper of discontent. People spoke in hushed tones behind closed doors, venting their frustrations only when they were sure no one could hear them. They talked of how things used to be, of how much they had lost. Some even spoke of rebellion. But talk was all it was. No one dared to act. No one dared to be the first to stand up. because everyone in San Luis Potosí knew what happened to those who defied Los Sangrientos. They had seen the bodies, heard the screams in the night, smelled the burning homes of those who thought they could fight back. And so, the people did what they had always done. They stayed silent. They obeyed. They survived. Alejandro Sandoval had always believed in justice. It was what had driven him to study law, what had given him the fire to dream of a different future, not just for himself, but for his town. He had grown up hearing his grandmother's quiet wisdom, her belief that a man should never bow to tyranny. Even though she never spoke directly about her past, he sensed that she had known struggle, that she had seen injustice up close. Perhaps that was why she had always told him to be careful. But Alejandro had never been one to stay silent. At 24, he was sharp-minded and restless, a young man who had spent years studying the law, learning how society was supposed to work. Corruption, he believed, thrived because good people allowed it. If enough people resisted, if they stood together, the cartel could not control them all. That belief, however, was not shared by the rest of San Luis Potosí. The day his defiance became dangerous began like any other. Alejandro had just finished helping his grandmother close up the bakery when two cartel enforcers stepped inside. They were young, no older than him, dressed in black with the emblem of Los Sangrientos stitched onto their jackets. One of them, a lanky man with a scar across his jaw, stepped forward. "You're late on your payment," he said, his tone casual as if discussing the weather. Alejandro folded his arms. "We paid last week." Scarjaw smirked. "That was last week. This is today." Elena, ever the silent observer, watched from behind the counter. She said nothing, her face unreadable. Alejandro, on the other hand, felt his blood boil. "This isn't right," he said firmly. "You can't keep increasing the payment whenever you feel like it." The second enforcer chuckled, shaking his head. "You think this is up for discussion?" Alejandro clenched his fists, his heart hammering. He wanted to fight, to push back, to do something. But then he felt his grandmother's gaze on him, calm, unwavering. It was a silent warning. Not here, not now. Through gritted teeth, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a handful of bills, slamming them on the counter. The enforcer took his time picking them up, flipping through them before stuffing them into his pocket. He patted Alejandro's shoulder as if they were old friends. "Smart choice," he said. "Next week, bring more." As they walked out, Alejandro felt his anger rise to a dangerous level. He turned to his grandmother, expecting her to say something, to agree that this had gone too far. But she only wiped the counter with slow, deliberate movements. "You shouldn't have paid them," he said, his voice tight. "And if I hadn't?" she asked softly, not looking up. Alejandro had no answer. Later that night, as he walked home, his frustration bubbled over. He couldn't accept this. He had spent years studying law, believing in justice, yet here he was, watching criminals run the town while good people bowed their heads. That was when he saw them again. The two enforcers stood near a convenience store, leaning against their motorcycles, laughing about something. Alejandro's hands curled into fists. He knew it was reckless, but in that moment, he didn't care. He marched toward them. "You think you own this town?" he said, his voice steady despite the anger burning inside him. "You're just parasites. You steal from people who are too afraid to fight back." The laughter stopped. Scarjaw tilted his head, a slow grin spreading across his face. "You got a problem, little lawyer?" Alejandro didn't flinch. "Yeah, my problem is cowards like you who think a gun makes them powerful." The enforcer's grin widened, but there was no humor in it. He took a step forward, closing the space between them. Alejandro stood his ground. "You got guts," Scarjaw murmured. "Not a lot of brains, though." Before Alejandro could react, the enforcer's fist connected with his stomach, knocking the wind out of him. He stumbled back, gasping, but they didn't give him a chance to recover. A second blow struck his ribs, Then a knee to his face sent him crashing to the ground. Blood filled his mouth. He tried to push himself up, but a boot pressed down on his back, pinning him to the dirt. "You talk big for a kid who doesn't know how things work," the enforcer sneered. "Consider this a warning." The pressure increased, making it harder to breathe. Alejandro's vision blurred. He barely registered their laughter as they finally stepped away, leaving him coughing and struggling to rise. As they mounted their bikes, Scarjaw turned back to him one last time. "Next time, keep your mouth shut." The roar of their engines faded into the night. Alejandro wiped the blood from his lips, his whole body aching, but his fury burned hotter than ever. He had made a mistake. He had underestimated them, but he wasn't done. Not yet. The morning sun had barely begun to rise over San Luis Potosí when the cartel decided to make an example of Alejandro Sandoval. The market square, usually a place of quiet commerce in the early hours, had become the stage for yet another reminder of who truly ruled the town. It started with the sound of a truck engine revving aggressively, tires screeching as a black pickup skidded to a stop in the middle of the square. The few vendors who had already set up their stalls froze, their hands gripping half-unpacked goods, their eyes darting toward the armed men spilling out of the vehicle. Los Sangrientos. Then they saw him. Alejandro, dragged from the truck, his face already bruised from the beating he had received the night before. His shirt was torn, blood staining the collar where his lip had split open. He tried to resist, but two cartel enforcers held him firmly, shoving him forward until he stumbled to his knees on the sun-baked cobblestone. Whispers spread through the crowd. People stopped what they were doing, their fear stronger than their instinct to flee. They had seen this before. They knew what it meant. The cartel didn't just punish, they made sure everyone watched. Juan Diablo Carrera stepped out of the truck last, adjusting the sleeves of his dark button-up shirt with practiced ease. His eyes, sharp and predatory, scanned the gathering crowd before settling on Alejandro. A slow, satisfied smirk spread across his face as he crouched beside him, patting his shoulder as if they were old friends. "I gave you a warning, kid," Juan said, his voice deceptively casual. "And yet, here we are." Alejandro glared up at him, defiance still burning in his eyes despite the pain. He spat blood onto the ground between them. Juan chuckled, shaking his head. "You've got fight, I'll give you that," he said, standing up again. "But you don't seem to understand how things work around here." Without warning, he stepped back and motioned to one of his men. The enforcer swung a steel pipe, striking Alejandro across the ribs with a sickening crack. A sharp gasp tore from his throat as he collapsed onto his side, clutching his ribs in agony. A few gasps escaped from the watching crowd, but no one moved. No one dared to intervene. From the far end of the square, Elena Sandoval sat motionless in her wheelchair, her face unreadable as she watched her grandson writhing on the ground. Her hands, hidden in the folds of her shawl, remained still. To anyone looking at her, she was nothing more than a helpless old woman witnessing something she had no power to stop. But inside her, something cold and ancient stirred. Juan turned back to Alejandro, rolling his shoulders as if warming up for a fight. He reached down and grabbed the young man by the collar, yanking him upright before delivering a brutal punch to his stomach. Alejandro gagged, doubling over, but Juan didn't let him fall. He lifted him again, this time slamming his fist into his jaw. Another sickening crunch. More blood. The whispers in the crowd died down completely. Silence settled over the square, heavy and suffocating. "This town belongs to us," Juan announced, his voice carrying through the empty streets. "And we don't tolerate disrespect." He let go of Alejandro, letting him crumble to the ground. Then he turned his gaze to the crowd, eyes scanning each and every face. "Let this be a lesson," he continued, his tone darkening. "If you step out of line, this is what happens." His men laughed, satisfied with the morning's entertainment. One of them kicked Alejandro in the ribs for good measure before stepping back toward the truck. Elena remained still, Her breathing was even. Her expression never changed. Juan glanced toward her briefly as if acknowledging her presence for the first time. There was something about the old woman's stare that made him pause, just for a moment. A strange flicker of something. But then, he dismissed it. What could she do? She was nothing. A crippled old lady. With a final smirk, he climbed into the truck. The engine roared to life, and within seconds they were gone, leaving behind only a broken young man and a town too afraid to move. The people slowly dispersed. Vendors returned to their stalls. Conversations resumed in hushed voices. No one helped Alejandro. No one even looked at him as he struggled to breathe, as he forced himself onto his hands and knees. Except for Elena. She wheeled herself forward, her movements slow and deliberate. She stopped beside her grandson, looking down at him. Alejandro, barely able to lift his head, looked up at her through swollen eyes. He tried to speak, but the pain choked the words before they could form. Elena reached into the folds of her shawl and pulled out a handkerchief. She held it out to him. "Get up," she said softly. Alejandro hesitated before forcing himself onto his feet, swaying slightly as he took the handkerchief from her trembling fingers. Elena watched him for a long moment, then slowly turned her chair around and began wheeling herself away, her eyes distant, unreadable. No one noticed how tightly she was gripping the armrests. No one saw the fire that had reignited in her gaze. No one knew that, after all these years, the ghost inside her had finally awakened. The dim glow of a single candle flickered inside Elena's modest home, casting long shadows across the wooden walls. She sat at her kitchen table, hands steady as she methodically disassembled the old Colt .45 she had kept hidden for years. Outside, the sound of crickets filled the night, oblivious to the storm brewing inside the heart of a woman who had spent decades trying to forget who she once was. But ghosts never stayed buried for long. Years ago, before she was just an old woman in a quiet Mexican town, Elena Morales had another name. A name whispered in fear among the most ruthless cartel leaders. Agent Isabella Ferrer. She had been one of the FBI's most elite undercover operatives, specializing in infiltrating cartel networks and bringing them to their knees. Her beauty had been her weapon, her intelligence a razor-sharp blade, and her ruthlessness a secret buried beneath a warm, deceptive smile. She had spent years embedded in the deepest layers of organized crime, posing as the trusted confidant of men who thought themselves untouchable. She had learned their habits, their weaknesses, their greed. One by one, she had dismantled entire syndicates from the inside, feeding intelligence back to her handlers and ensuring each domino fell precisely as planned. But the life of an undercover agent had a cost. She had been hunted, tortured, watched friends and informants die for the sake of a mission. And then, finally, she had orchestrated her own death, a staged assassination that freed her from the blood-soaked chess game she had played for far too long. With no family left to protect and her real identity forever erased, she became Elena Morales, the harmless old woman in a sleepy village, a ghost with no past. Now, as she reassembled her firearm with the precision of a soldier, she felt the years melt away. The woman she had buried was clawing her way back to the surface. The cartel had come to her doorstep, believing her to be nothing more than a helpless grandmother. They had made a mistake that would cost them everything. She reached for a small wooden box hidden beneath the floorboards. Inside, a collection of items lay untouched for decades. A burner phone, old IDs, and a necklace that had once belonged to her closest ally, a fellow agent who hadn't been as lucky as her. She clenched the pendant in her fist, a silent vow forming in her mind. They had underestimated her. They would regret it. The candle burned low, wax pooling at its base as Elena sat in silence. The weight of the Colt .45 in her hand was familiar, yet foreign. Years had passed since she last held a weapon, since she last allowed the old instincts to take over. Her fingers traced the metal, the cold steel awakening something inside her, something she had spent years trying to suppress. She had run from this life, abandoned the battlefield in search of peace. But peace was an illusion, a fragile dream shattered by the brutality of the men who had taken her grandson's blood. She could still hear Alejandro's voice, the way he had always laughed without restraint, the way his eyes had shone with unshakable belief in the goodness of the world. And now, that world had betrayed him. It had left him broken, lying in a hospital bed, fighting to stay alive. Could she do this again? Could she become the woman she had buried all those years ago? The war had already begun, not in the streets, but in her mind. The hospital room was eerily quiet, save for the steady beeping of the monitors. Alejandro lay motionless, his small body swallowed by the oversized bed, his face pale against the white sheets. Tubes snaked from his arms, delivering the medicine that fought to keep him breathing. Elena sat beside him, her fingers gently brushing a stray curl from his forehead. He did not stir. She had seen death countless times, had watched men fall, had witnessed the devastation of violence up close. But nothing had prepared her for this. Nothing had prepared her for the helplessness of seeing the one person she loved most in the world reduced to this fragile state. Her jaw tightened. Her heart hardened. A soft shuffle outside the door caught her attention. She turned, her senses sharpening, old instincts kicking in. A nurse stepped inside, carrying a clipboard, but Elena didn't relax. She would never relax again. The cartel had done this. They had walked into her life and set it ablaze without a second thought. They had seen a defenseless old woman and assumed she would crumble. She would show them their mistake. As she left the hospital, the decision was already made. The woman known as Elena Morales was gone. In her place stood Isabella Ferrer. The ghost had returned. She walked the dimly lit streets of her town, every step a promise, every breath a vow. The past and present had merged into something unstoppable. The pain, the loss, the years of hiding. It all burned away in the fire of her resolve. They thought they had destroyed her family. They thought they had silenced her. But they had only awakened the deadliest ghost they would ever know. The town slept under a blanket of silence, unaware that death lurked in the shadows. A cold wind blew through the empty streets, rustling the trees, carrying the scent of rain. But Elena Morales was not listening to the wind. She was listening to the slow, steady footsteps of the man she had marked for death. His name was Raúl Ortega, an informant, a parasite who thrived in the spaces between power and cowardice. He wasn't a soldier nor a killer, but he was worse. He was the eyes and ears of the cartel, feeding them whispers and selling out innocent lives for a handful of pesos. He had known who Alejandro was. He had known what would happen when he spoke his name to the wrong people. Now, he would pay for it. Elena followed Raúl through the alleyways, moving with the silence of a ghost. The old woman she had once been, frail, slow, harmless, no longer existed. Every step was measured, every movement controlled. The darkness welcomed her like an old friend. Raúl hummed to himself, unaware of the fate stalking him. He reeked of cheap beer and sweat, his posture lazy, as if he had no worries in the world. The arrogance of a man who thought himself untouchable. He stopped outside his apartment, fumbling with his keys. His fingers were slow, clumsy. He was drunk, maybe high. It wouldn't matter. Elena stepped out of the shadows. A flicker of movement in the corner of his eye made Raúl turn, but it was already too late. She struck fast, her hands moving with the precision of a woman who had ended lives before. A sharp jab to his throat cut off his breath before he could scream. His body jerked, confusion flashing in his eyes. She shoved him inside his own apartment, kicking the door shut behind them. Raúl gasped, clutching at his throat, his body stumbling backward. His bloodshot eyes tried to make sense of what was happening, but the alcohol dulled his instincts. He recognized her too late. Abuela? He choked out, his voice barely a whisper. Elena didn't answer. She pulled a garrote wire from her pocket, wrapping it around his throat in one swift motion. His hands shot up, clawing at the steel, cutting into his flesh. His body thrashed, legs kicking over a table, knocking over a bottle of tequila that shattered on the floor. The stench of liquor filled the air as he struggled, but Elena didn't let go. She tightened her grip, her arms steady. His muffled gasps turned to gurgles, his feet scraping against the floor in a desperate attempt to hold on to life. But there was no mercy here. She watched the light fade from his eyes. When his body went still, she lowered him to the ground, her hands calm, her breathing even. There was no hesitation, no regret. He had played his part in her grandson's suffering. Now, he was gone. She wiped her hands on a rag, checked the room for any signs of her presence, then slipped back into the night. By morning, the town would hear of Raul Ortega's murder. The cartel would take notice, but they would not panic. To them, he was nothing more than a low-level informant, a man with too many enemies. They would chalk it up to a drunken fight, a personal grudge. They would not see the pattern. Not yet. But Elena was just getting started. The streets of the small town moved at a slow, predictable rhythm. Shopkeepers opened their stalls at sunrise, women carried baskets of fresh produce, children ran barefoot through the dusty roads. But beneath the surface, a darker current pulsed through the town, a silent war of power, money, and blood. The cartel moved like shadows in broad daylight, hiding in plain sight. Elena sat on a worn wooden bench in the town square, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, knitting needles clicking softly in her hands. To anyone passing by, she was just another grandmother lost in the monotony of old age. But behind her weathered eyes, her mind worked like a machine. She was studying, calculating, remembering. She had done this before. Years of undercover work had trained her to observe without being seen, to read men's habits like an open book. It had been years since she had needed these skills, but muscle memory had a way of returning when called upon. She watched the cartel's movements, noting every detail. The men stationed outside the cantina, the ones who loitered near the auto shop, the routes they took when making their drug deliveries. They thought they were careful, but no one was truly careful when they believed themselves untouchable. Elena learned their shifts, their meeting places, their weaknesses. One of them, a young sicario named Luis, had a habit of sneaking into the back alleys to meet a woman he wasn't supposed to be seen with. Another, the local enforcer, had a tell. Whenever he was about to get violent, he rolled his shoulders as if loosening his muscles. Every man had a routine. Every routine had an opening. Elena wasn't just gathering information, she was planting seeds. A stolen cell phone left in a cartel driver's truck with its GPS tracking enabled. A whispered rumor to the right ears, making the men question each other's loyalty. A single unnoticed cut in the tires of a cartel vehicle, delaying a shipment just long enough to create tension. She was turning them against each other without them realizing it. She also knew who to watch closely. Miguel El Toro Ramirez, the cartel's local lieutenant, was ruthless, but his power depended on fear. If that fear was shaken, he would start making mistakes, and mistakes would get him killed. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, Elena had what she needed. Her plan was no longer just forming. It was alive, unfolding step by step. The cartel still saw her as nothing, a harmless old woman, but soon they would feel the weight of their ignorance. One by one, they would fall, and by the time they realized what was happening, it would already be too late. The morning air was thick with tension. Whispers of a second disappearance spread through the streets like wildfire, carried by nervous glances and hushed conversations. Another cartel member was gone, vanished into the night just like Raul Ortega. This time it was Diego Salgado, a mid-level enforcer known for his brutal tactics. He had been seen drinking at the cantina the night before, laughing with his usual arrogance, throwing money at the bartender. And then nothing. No one had seen him leave. No body had been found. Just silence. Silence was the worst thing of all. Vicente Navarro, one of the cartel's top lieutenants, sat in the back room of the auto shop, his fingers drumming against the wooden table. His men stood around him, their faces tight with unease. These men had always been loud, overconfident, believing themselves untouchable. But now there was something different in their eyes. Doubt. "Where the hell is Diego?" Vicente snapped, his voice sharp. "Two men don't just disappear." No one had an answer. The cartel had ruled this town through fear, but fear was a dangerous thing when it turned inward. The men exchanged uneasy glances, shifting on their feet. If someone was hunting them, they needed to know who. But there was no evidence, no witnesses, no message left behind, at least not one they understood. Elena watched from the shadows as the cartel scrambled. She had spent years inside organizations like this, watching how paranoia spread like a disease. They weren't afraid of what they knew. They were afraid of what they didn't. And she made sure to feed that fear. A bloodied playing card left on the seat of Vicente's truck. A Queen of Hearts, its meaning unknown to him but unmistakable in its warning. A single bullet placed carefully on Miguel El Toro Ramirez's doorstep. A phrase scrawled in black marker on the back wall of the cantina. Todos los demonios caen. All demons fall. They didn't know who was behind it. They didn't know why it was happening. That was the beauty of it. Juan Diablo Velázquez, the cartel's head enforcer, took charge of the investigation. Unlike Vicente, Diablo was not a man who panicked easily. He was a predator, sharp-eyed and ruthless. He didn't believe in ghosts. He believed in threats, and threats needed to be eliminated. He gathered the men, ordered them to double their patrols, to keep their guns close. He sent his best trackers into the streets, demanding answers. Someone was playing games with them, and he wanted blood. But Elena knew men like him, knew how their minds worked. He was used to hunting, to being the one who instilled fear in others. But he had never been hunted. She would teach him what it felt like. As night fell, the town braced itself for the storm brewing in the darkness. The cartel had begun to turn on itself, suspicion creeping into their ranks. Elena smiled to herself as she vanished into the shadows. The real hunt was only just beginning. The town felt different. The air, once thick with the cartel's unchecked arrogance, was now tainted with something far more dangerous: uncertainty. Gone were the days of enforcers laughing in the cantina, flashing their pistols like kings of the underworld. Now they moved in groups, their hands twitching near their holsters, their eyes scanning every face in the crowd. Something was hunting them, and they didn't know what. Vicente Navarro stood in the center of the marketplace, his jaw tight, his temper barely restrained. His men had spread out, questioning vendors, shaking down store owners, looking for anyone who had seen something. Anything. But there were no answers. Only frightened stares and nervous denials. A butcher stood sweating under Vicente's glare as one of the sicarios pressed a pistol into his ribs. "You see anything strange last night?" Vicente asked, his voice sharp, his patience thin. The butcher shook his head rapidly. "No, senor. I close early now. Too dangerous outside." Vicente studied him, looking for the lie. But there was nothing. Just the genuine fear of a man caught between the cartel and whatever was coming for them. He cursed under his breath and signaled his men to move on. It wasn't just the lack of evidence that unsettled him. It was the silence. Whoever was hunting them wasn't leaving bodies in the street as a warning. They weren't making a show of their attacks. It was quiet, surgical, precise. And that made it worse. Elena watched from a rooftop hidden in the shadows. Vicente and his men moved below like rats, their heads snapping at every sudden noise. She could see it in their posture, the tension, the barely restrained panic. The cartel had never been afraid before, They had never needed to be. She had changed that. From her vantage point, she took note of their formations, the way they moved in tighter groups now, how they rarely let their backs go unguarded. They had started wearing body armor, carrying heavier weapons, but it wouldn't help them. They were looking for an assassin, a lone killer striking from the shadows. But Elena wasn't just a killer. She was a strategist, a ghost who had spent years inside the minds of men like these. She wasn't picking them off randomly. She was dismantling them from within, piece by piece. And soon it would no longer be about fear. Soon it would be war. Back at her home, she laid out her weapons with practiced care. The silenced pistol, the combat knife, the makeshift explosives crafted from household materials. Every tool had a purpose. Every move she made was part of the larger game. The cartel thought they had control, that their numbers would protect them. But numbers didn't matter when your enemy was invisible. She had forced them into a defensive stance, made them doubt their own strength. Now, it was time to push harder, a direct strike, a message written in blood. The night would not end without another death. And this time, they would know. Whoever was hunting them wasn't stopping. Not until they were all gone. The safe house sat on the outskirts of town, hidden behind rusted metal gates and crumbling brick walls. To an outsider, it looked like just another abandoned property, forgotten, unimportant. But inside, it pulsed with activity. Cartel enforcers moved through the dimly lit rooms, counting stacks of cash, weighing bricks of cocaine, loading rifles for the next shipment. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and overconfidence. They felt safe here, untouchable. That was about to change. Elena crouched in the darkness, her breathing slow, controlled. The cold metal of her suppressed pistol pressed against her palm, a familiar weight. Years of training had conditioned her body to move without sound, to become nothing more than a shadow. The first step of any successful ambush was control, and the first thing she needed to control was their communication. She had already sabotaged their radios earlier in the evening, cutting wires, disrupting frequencies. Their cell signals were jammed, another small trick she had learned in her past life. They wouldn't know they were under attack until it was too late. She moved along the perimeter, avoiding the lone guard stationed at the entrance. He leaned against the wall, distracted, a cigarette dangling from his lips. One swift motion. A knife to the throat, a muffled gurgle, a body lowered to the ground. The first death was always the quietest. Inside, 6 men sat around a table, drinking, laughing, counting their money. A 7th leaned against the far wall, his rifle propped against his knee. None of them had their weapons in hand. They weren't expecting trouble. Elena stepped through the doorway. The first shot caught the man nearest to her in the head. Before his body hit the table, she pivoted, firing twice more. Another cartel soldier slumped back in his chair, his chest torn open. The room erupted into chaos. Chairs scraped against the floor. Men shouted, scrambling for their weapons. Too slow. Elena dropped one more with a bullet to the throat before diving behind a stack of crates. The remaining men fired blindly, spraying bullets into the walls, shattering bottles, tearing through stacks of dirty cash. She listened, calculated, knew their panic would make them reckless. A shadow moved on her left. A mistake. She fired once, dropping the man mid-step. The last 2 rushed toward the back door, running. Elena moved fast. One was dead before his hand reached the handle. The other barely turned before she drove her knife into his ribs, twisting deep, feeling the breath leave his body as he collapsed at her feet. Silence. The safe house was nothing more than a slaughterhouse now. Elena moved methodically, wiping down her weapons, making sure nothing tied her to the scene. But she wasn't here just to kill. She was here to send a message. She dipped her fingers into a pool of blood, dragging them across the wall in slow, deliberate strokes. Soy el fantasma. I am the ghost. By morning, Vicente would hear of this massacre. He would see the message, And he would know. This wasn't an accident. This was war. The town was drowning in fear. By the time the sun rose after the Safe House massacre, Vicente Navarro had turned every street into a trap. Armed sicarios patrolled in pairs, their rifles swinging from side to side as they scanned the faces of terrified civilians. Roadblocks choked the town's exits, each guarded by men too paranoid to let anyone pass without a full inspection. No one entered. No one left. The people, already living under the cartel's iron grip, now found themselves suffocating under its desperation. The curfew was announced that morning. Anyone caught outside after dark would be considered an enemy. By noon, the first example was made. A fruit vendor accused of spying was dragged from his stall and beaten in front of his family. His screams were a message. His silence, once it finally came, was a warning. The cartel had lost control, and now they were punishing the entire town for it. Juan Diablo Velázquez moved through the streets like a rabid dog, his men dragging suspected informants from their homes. His orders were clear. If anyone knew who had attacked the cartel, they would talk, or they would die. Doors were kicked in. Families were ripped apart. Some were tortured in the alleys, their agonized wails echoing through the town. Others were taken away, their fates unknown, their homes left eerily quiet in their absence. The people kept their eyes to the ground, their voices swallowed by fear. No one dared to ask questions. And yet, despite the cartel's show of force, the enemy remained unseen. The ghost still walked among them. Elena watched from a rooftop as a group of sicarios pulled a young man from his home, his mother wailing at their feet. They accused him of working with the enemy, of feeding information to an invisible force that had already claimed two of their own. He swore he knew nothing. It didn't matter. The cartel was at war with something they didn't understand. And when men like Vicente Navarro didn't understand something, they turned to destruction. Elena knew the signs well. Vicente wasn't thinking clearly anymore. He was reacting, lashing out, spreading his men thin in an attempt to control what could no longer be controlled. He was breaking his own organization from the inside. She just needed to push a little harder. For now, she remained unseen. The curfews, the lockdowns, the mass arrests, they weren't meant for someone like her. The cartel was looking for a soldier, a rival gang, maybe even a lone assassin. They weren't looking for a quiet grandmother, slipping unnoticed through the back alleys, blending with the terrified crowds. She listened. She learned. She waited. Vicente was tightening his grip, but his hands were already shaking. And soon, he would be too weak to hold on at all. The cartel was bleeding, and Vicente Navarro knew it. 2 men gone without a trace. A safe house wiped out in a single night. Their network of fear, once unshakable, now riddled with cracks. If he didn't act now, it wouldn't just be his soldiers whispering about ghosts, it would be his superiors, and they would not be as forgiving. Juan Diablo Velázquez had a solution. "We set a trap," he told Vicente, standing in the candlelit office of the auto shop that now served as their war room. His voice was calm, but his eyes burned with frustration. "She's watching us. She's studying us. We feed her what she wants to see." Vicente exhaled a long stream of smoke, watching it curl toward the ceiling. He nodded slowly. "Make it happen." By morning, word had spread through the town. There was movement at the old train yard, one of the cartel's key supply points. A large shipment of weapons was being moved, lightly guarded. A perfect opportunity. Elena heard the whispers. She knew the bait when she saw it, but a trap only worked if the prey walked in blind. And Elena was no prey. The train yard was a graveyard of rusted steel and broken tracks. Abandoned locomotives sat like forgotten relics, their empty windows like hollow eyes staring into the night. Elena moved through the shadows, her senses sharp, her heart steady. She had approached from the eastern wall, slipping through a gap in the chain-link fence. She counted 6 men stationed near the shipment, too few for something this important. And then she saw them. In the distance, hidden behind shipping containers, more sicarios waited in silence. At least 10 more, rifles loaded, eyes scanning the dark. They were expecting her. Good. She adjusted the homemade explosive strapped to her chest, not to herself, but to the vest she had draped over a stray dog she had found earlier. A harmless trick from her past life. The dog, unaware of its role in the night's violence, padded toward the shipment, its tail wagging. The first explosion tore through the silence. Chaos erupted. The blast sent 2 men flying backward, their bodies slamming against the metal walls of a container. The others scrambled for cover, yelling orders into their radios. But their radios were dead. She had jammed their frequency hours ago. Elena moved fast. From her position behind an old train car, she fired twice, dropping another sicario before he could even raise his rifle. Diablo, crouched behind a crate, shouted, "Move in! Spread out!" It was the exact mistake she had counted on. They thought they were the hunters. They had no idea they were the ones being hunted. One by one, they fell. A knife across the throat of a man who had strayed too far from his group. A bullet to the head of another who foolishly thought his vest would protect him. The smoke and dust mixed with blood, turning the train yard into a battlefield of ghosts. By the time the last shot echoed into the night, only 2 figures remained standing. Elena, breathing steady, and Juan Diablo, bloodied and furious, his pistol shaking in his grip. He stared at her, disbelief in his eyes. "Who the hell are you?" he growled. Elena stepped forward, slow and deliberate. "I am the ghost you made," she said softly, tilting her head. "I am every mother, every grandmother, every woman you thought was weak. And now I am your end." His finger tightened on the trigger. She was faster, 1 shot, straight through the skull. Diablo collapsed, the last of Vicente's most trusted men, now nothing more than a lifeless corpse. As she walked away, she left one final message, scrawled in blood across the rusted metal of the shipping container. La viuda fantasma se acerca. The ghost widow is coming. By morning, the town would know. The cartel would know. And Vicente Navarro would understand. His days were numbered. The call came just before dawn. Elena had been cleaning her weapons, preparing for her next move, when the burner phone vibrated against the wooden table. No one had this number. No one except the dead. She answered, saying nothing. A deep, satisfied voice filled the silence. "You thought you could hide forever, vieja?" Vicente Navarro's tone was laced with cruel amusement, but underneath it she heard the strain, the fear. "You think you're the only one who knows how to play this game?" Then came the sound that made her blood freeze, a weak, muffled cry. "Alejandro." Her grip on the phone tightened. "He's still alive, and for now." Vicente exhaled as if savoring the moment. "But if you want him to stay that way, you'll come to me, alone." Silence stretched between them. Then he chuckled. "You have until sundown, abuela." The line went dead. Elena's fingers curled into fists. She had spent weeks controlling the battlefield, making them move to her rhythm, trapping them in their own paranoia. But now, Vicente had flipped the board. She had always known he would strike back. She just never thought he'd be desperate enough to take Alejandro. She closed her eyes, forcing herself to breathe. There was no room for rage. No time for fear. Those emotions had no place in the mind of a killer. She had to think. Elena wasted no time. She needed information. Where they had taken him. How many men were guarding him. What Vicente's next move would be. She retraced the cartel's movements from the last 24 hours, the sudden disappearances of their patrols from certain streets, the whispers of a convoy seen heading toward the old slaughterhouse outside town. It fit. Vicente would want somewhere isolated, somewhere she couldn't ambush them. He was preparing for war. But he had made one mistake. He thought she would come like a grieving grandmother, ready to beg. He had forgotten who she truly was. Dressed in black, her weapons hidden beneath her shawl, Elena stepped onto the dirt road leading to the slaughterhouse as the sun dipped below the horizon. She could see the headlights in the distance, the silhouettes of armed men waiting for her. They thought she was walking into a trap. They didn't realize she was the trap. The night was heavy with the scent of blood and gunpowder. Clouds swallowed the moon, casting the cartel's compound in deep shadows. The fortress stood on the edge of town, a sprawling estate surrounded by high walls, armed guards patrolling the perimeter like restless wolves. Inside, Vicente Navarro waited, believing himself untouchable. Elena Morales moved through the darkness, silent as death. The weight of her weapons sat comfortably against her body, a suppressed pistol strapped to her thigh, a combat knife at her hip, and an M4 carbine slung across her back. She was no longer the grieving grandmother the cartel had underestimated. She was a soldier, and tonight, she was bringing a war. 2 guards stood at the main entrance, smoking, their rifles lazily slung over their shoulders. They weren't expecting a direct assault. A suppressed shot cracked the night. The first man dropped before he could exhale his final breath. The second barely had time to turn before Elena closed the distance, slamming her knife deep into his throat. She caught his body before it hit the ground, lowering him silently. Blood pooled at her feet. The gates were open. She slipped inside. The courtyard was alive with cartel activity. Trucks parked in rows, men gathered near the garage, talking, laughing, drinking. They had no idea death had already stepped into their home. Elena moved fast. She used the shadows, weaving through blind spots, staying low. She had studied the compound for days, learning its patterns, its weaknesses. She reached the generator shed and planted a small explosive charge. 30 seconds. She took cover behind a truck, watching the countdown on her watch. 3, 2, 1. The explosion ripped through the compound, plunging the estate into total darkness. Panic erupted. Shouts rang through the night. Flashlights flickered on. Confusion spread like wildfire. The cartel's men stumbled, blind and unorganized. And that's when Elena struck. She picked them off methodically. A man near the garage, 1 shot to the head, another by the main house, 2 rounds to the chest. She moved like a phantom, striking from the darkness, her suppressed rifle spitting death before her enemies even knew where to aim. They fired wildly, shooting at shadows. But shadows didn't bleed. She took cover behind a statue as more men flooded the courtyard. Vicente's top enforcers, desperate to regain control. They fanned out, barking orders, but she had already anticipated their response. She threw a smoke grenade. Thick clouds billowed, swallowing them whole. They coughed, cursed, fired into the nothingness. Elena stepped through the haze, blade in hand. 1, a knife across the jugular. 2, a silenced shot through the skull. 3, a bullet straight to the heart. Bodies hit the ground. The smoke cleared. The compound was littered with the dead. And at the top of the grand staircase, staring down in horror, was Vicente Navarro. He wasn't laughing now. Elena reloaded, her movements steady. The last of Vicente's men ran for cover, but there was none left. The fortress he had built was collapsing, and she was coming for him next. The mansion reeked of gunpowder and death. Smoke curled through the corridors, the echoes of gunfire still ringing in the halls. Bodies lay sprawled across the floor, the cartel's once mighty fortress reduced to a slaughterhouse. But one man still stood, Juan Diablo Velázquez. Elena found him in the grand hall, waiting. Blood smeared his face, a gash above his eye leaking down his cheek. His shirt was torn, his knuckles bruised from the fight outside. He clutched a machete in one hand, a pistol in the other. "Old woman," he sneered, his breath ragged. You should have died a long time ago. Elena stepped forward, the grip on her knife tightening. Pain throbbed in her side. A bullet had grazed her ribs during the assault, but she ignored it. She had fought through worse. I should have, she admitted, but I didn't. Diablo lunged first, swinging the machete in a wide arc. Elena ducked, the blade slicing inches from her face. She countered with a quick stab toward his ribs, but he twisted away, slamming his elbow into her wounded side. Pain exploded through her body, but she gritted her teeth and stayed on her feet. Diablo was bigger, stronger, younger. He fought like a man used to overpowering his enemies, relying on brute force to win his battles. But Elena fought differently. She had survived not by being the strongest, but by being the smartest. Diablo swung again, aiming to cleave her skull in two. She sidestepped at the last second, letting the blade bury itself into the wooden pillar behind her. Before he could recover, she drove her knee into his gut, then brought her elbow crashing down onto the back of his neck. He staggered but didn't fall. Instead, he roared and charged, tackling her to the ground. The impact knocked the breath from her lungs. They rolled across the blood-soaked marble floor, each struggling for control. Diablo's weight pressed down on her, his hands closing around her throat. Elena's vision darkened at the edges, her air supply cut off. But she wasn't done yet. With the last of her strength, she reached for the knife strapped to her thigh. With a quick flick of her wrist, she slashed across his forearm. Diablo howled in pain, his grip loosening just enough. She didn't hesitate. With a burst of energy, she flipped their positions, straddling his chest, her knife pressed to his throat. "You killed families," she whispered, "burned homes, tortured children." Diablo spat blood, his lips curling into a smirk. "And I'd do it again." Elena didn't let him say another word. She drove the blade deep into his throat, twisting it slowly. Diablo gurgled, his body jerking beneath her. Blood spilled down his chest, his final breath rattling in his lungs. Then he went still. Elena pushed herself up, breathing hard. Pain pulsed through every inch of her body, but she didn't falter. Diablo was dead. The reign of terror he had built with his bare hands had come to an end. By hers. She wiped the blood from her knife and stood. Vicente Navarro was still alive, and now there was nothing left standing between her and him. The mansion was collapsing around him. Vicente Navarro ran through the smoke-filled corridors, his once pristine white suit stained with blood, some his own, some belonging to the men who had died trying to protect him. The echoes of gunfire had faded, replaced by an eerie silence. His empire, his fortress, everything he had built with blood and terror, was gone. Now there was only him and her, the ghost, Elena Morales. She was coming. Vicente shoved open a door and stumbled into his office, slamming it shut behind him. His hands shook as he locked it, knowing it wouldn't matter. He backed away, his chest heaving, eyes darting around the room. The safe in the corner? Useless. The stack of cash on his desk? Meaningless. The bottle of whiskey? Tempting. He reached for the pistol tucked into his waistband, his last lifeline, his last defense. The doorknob twisted. He raised the gun, sweat dripping from his forehead. His heart pounded in his ears. Then, silence. Nothing. Maybe she was toying with him. Maybe she was already inside, watching him, waiting. "Come on, you bitch," he shouted, his voice cracking. "Face me!" No answer. Just the suffocating weight of his own fear. Then, click. The desk lamp flickered on. Vicente spun, his finger tightening on the trigger. Elena sat in his chair, calm, composed, watching him with the quiet patience of a woman who had already decided his fate. Her gun rested on the desk, inches from her hand, but she didn't reach for it. She didn't need to, because she had already won. Vicente staggered back, disbelief flashing across his face. "No," he breathed. "You... how?" Elena tilted her head. "You were too busy running to check if the room was empty." His grip on the pistol wavered. His breathing was ragged, uneven. "I can make you an offer," he stammered. "Money. Protection. You don't have to do this." Elena let out a quiet laugh, but there was no humor in it. "Do you think this was ever about money?" She stood, slow and deliberate. "This is about Alejandro, about every family you've torn apart, about the people who were too afraid to fight back." Vicente's desperation turned to rage. "I made this town," he spat. "They needed me." Elena stepped closer. "No, Vicente." Her voice was cold, final. "They needed you gone." Vicente raised his gun, but he was shaking. He had always been a man who let others do his killing for him. Now, standing face to face with death, his hands betrayed him. Elena didn't hesitate. One shot. The bullet tore through his chest. Vicente gasped, stumbling back, his legs giving out beneath him. He collapsed into his chair, blood blooming across his shirt like ink spreading through water. His breathing grew shallow. His eyes darted around the room, searching for something. Salvation, mercy, a second chance. There was none. Elena leaned down, meeting his fading gaze. "This is justice," she whispered. With one final breath, Vicente Navarro, the man who had ruled through fear, the monster who had believed himself untouchable, slumped forward, lifeless. The reign of terror was over. The town was free. Elena turned away, stepping into the night as the mansion burned behind her. The sun rose over the town, painting the sky in soft hues of orange and gold. For the first time in years, there were no gunmen patrolling the streets, no cartel trucks blocking the roads, no whispered fears hanging in the air like a curse. Vicente Navarro was dead. His empire had crumbled, and the people were free. It didn't happen overnight. Fear doesn't vanish with the death of one man, and wounds, both seen and unseen, take time to heal. But something had changed. Vendors reopened their stalls, selling fruit and bread without fear of extortion. Children played in the plaza again, their laughter no longer shadowed by the threat of violence. Families who had once kept their heads down now stood a little taller, speaking of the future rather than just survival. The police, long puppets of the cartel, now found themselves answering to the people instead of criminals. Some officers fled, fearing retribution. Others chose to stay, trying to mend the broken trust between law and the community. The town was not perfect. It never would be. But it was alive. And that was enough. Alejandro sat on the porch of the small clinic, his leg wrapped in fresh bandages, his face still bruised but healing. The past few days felt like a fever dream. One moment, he had been a helpless prisoner, staring into the cruel eyes of Vicente Navarro, and the next, he was waking up to the news that the cartel was gone. His grandmother had done it. The quiet woman who had raised him with gentle hands and soft lullabies had torn down an entire empire, leaving only whispers in her wake. He had always known she was strong, but he had never known she was this. A legend. Elena Morales, he murmured under his breath, testing the name, feeling its weight. No, that wasn't who she truly was. She was something more, something untouchable. La Viuda Fantasma, the ghost widow. He looked out over the town, searching for her familiar figure. But she was nowhere to be seen. Elena had left before dawn, slipping away as quietly as she had arrived. There was no celebration, no farewell. She did not belong to this town, or any town. Her war had ended, and she had no desire to linger among the ruins of what she had destroyed. She had done what needed to be done. That was enough. Some say she crossed the border, vanishing into the vastness of Mexico, never to be seen again. Others believe she still walks among them, watching from the shadows, waiting for the next monster to rise. But one thing was certain. The cartel had feared her. The people had whispered her name, and now she was a legend, a ghost, a warning to those who would dare take power through fear and blood. because if evil ever returned to this town, so would she. The town was free, but Elena Morales was nowhere to be found. She had come like a storm, silent and unforgiving, dismantling an empire built on fear. Now, she was just a whisper, a legend told in hushed voices, the ghost widow, the unseen force that had brought justice where none existed. No one knew where she had gone, but one thing was certain: if darkness ever returned, so would she. Because some ghosts never truly rest. If you enjoyed this story of vengeance, justice, and the rise of an unstoppable legend, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more thrilling vigilante tales. Would you stand against the darkness like Elena? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And remember, evil fears those who fight back. Stay tuned for the next chapter in the fight for justice.